make sure that I thank Professor Charmaine Joie for inviting me and for the students for voting for me to come here. I'm really honored by that. And to also, I want to thank of course, the organizers of Global Studies Colloquium, and to M. Rosner in particular for coordinating my visits, even though when I was a bad guest and didn't respond to emails properly. And I, of course, want to thank all of you for being here today. And just to add a note that I often say that, I'm in American Studies and Ethnicity, which is our form of like critical ethnic studies at USC. But I'm a geographer by training. But even my geography training was always spent half between Barrows Hall, which is ethnic studies at UC Berkeley, and the geography department, trying to make sense of an overwhelmingly white academic discipline, which geography still remains to be, and an ethnic studies program that was still trying to figure out this whole space thing and why I was interested in space to begin with. So I had Chicano studies professors on my committee and geographers on my committee, and that's kind of what shapes the way that I see the world, and through all my work. So I like to say that not only am I a Chicano, I'm actually trained in Chicano studies, to a certain extent, and to geography. So that will always shape the way that I write about the work that I do, which is my fascination with labor, capital, and the ecology. So today's talk is going to be a glimpse into a work in progress. And I want to thank Aida Hurtado, who's here from Chicano Studies. I gave a talk, I think it was last year or 2 years ago, I remember now, on my other book on Coachella, which now I'm up to like 55,000 words, and I'm hoping that that will be done by the end of the year. But this book, I put it on pause because I was working on that book, and this was a great invitation for me to get back on track and to get back onto like deadlines. And so I'm thankful for that. And I also, as I tell my colleagues, I'm on the executive board of the Warehouse Workers Research Center in the Inland Empire. And they're always like, where's the book? And I'm like, I abandoned it for Coachella, but I'm coming back to it. So here it is. So the snippets that I'm going to share today are part of this larger book project, and the preliminary title is, I kind of botched it here, but Guns, Amazon, and Modern Capitalism, Military Base Conversions in Southern California's Supply Chain. And with that said, I'm going to emphasize today that I have many more questions than I have answers at this point. But that some of the hardest work, as those of you who are writing, some of the hardest work involved in producing a piece of academic writing often includes figuring out a narrative thread that helps to make sense of all of the disparate points that you are engaged in and trying to put together into a larger story. And this is what I'm going to share with you today, this kind of narrative thread that I've worked through and that I hope makes sense. Okay, so let's get started. This is Amazon's Western Freight Hub. It's the company's largest second air hub in the country, and it happens to be located on the site of a former military base. Amazon announced its intentions to build the hub on the site of the San Bernardino Airport in May of 2020, and then it began operations less than a year later in April of 2021. This is another, image of what that represents. You can see the logistics center, which is essentially a distribution center, but it's an air cargo hub. This is what makes this particularly important to Amazon, because it only has 3 air cargo hubs in the country, although it has other facilities that deliver air goods, but these are the main hubs that essentially service the rest of the country. And this actually represents most of the goods that are coming in internationally and from other parts of the country, and then moving out to other locations. Okay. And this is the former Norton Air Force Base in San Bernardino, California, which was shut down in 1994. And in today's talk, I'm going to show you another image here. This is later on, and sometimes I think in the late 80s, you could see some activities at the Norton Air Force Base before it was shut down. So today's talk is going to focus on how this military base and its conversion into a global logistics hub is part of a larger trend in the region. For instance, 2 other former military bases in inland Southern California have been converted into logistics hubs. These are the March Air Force Base in Riverside and the George Air Force Base in Victorville. I'm going to show you, I had a map that I was going to show you, but I'm not going to do that now because we had this thing where we changed computers. So I'm going to just show you an overview of where they are. This is the George Air Force Base, which is now known as an Inland Ports and Logistics Airport in Southern California. You can see the city of Victorville here. You can see the outline, but they're trying to convert this not only into an airport, but also an inland port that's serviced by the BNSF main rail corridor that is also located near this facility. And then this is the March Air Force Base, which is in Riverside, California, actually right by UC Riverside. And you can see the plans that have been developed to convert this into a distribution center. And you can see up here, Amazon is actually also operating at that base. Now, what I'm not going to talk about today, but is part of the book, is the fact that March Air Force Base is also the logistics center for the military base. There's actually still a military installation there. And that military installation gathers all of the data that comes in from drones, underground sensors, border patrol agents, blimps, airplanes, all of the stuff that the United States is using to monitor the US-Mexico border. All of that data is transmitted to March Air Force Base, and March Air Force Base provides kind of like a God's eye view of what's happening in terms of the US-Mexico border. And so this is what I'm writing about also in the book. And it just so happens that Amazon runs the data infrastructure for that project as well, right? So essentially, it's a logistics hub for border enforcement and also a logistics hub for these kinds of consumer goods that you can see here. And UPS, of course, is present as well. Okay. All right. So all 3 of the bases that I've just mentioned were shut down during the Base Realignment and Closure Commission, or the BRAC process of the late 1980s and early 1990s. And the conversion of these former military bases or sites into logistics hub lead me to ask 3 big questions. And these are the kind of 3 big questions that I'm grappling with as I write this book. And here are, let me just show you what those are. First is, how does the closure of these 3 bases and their reconfiguration as a logistics hub relate to changes in the military and geopolitical strategies of the post-Cold War period? Okay. And the second question is, what does the conversion of these public military sites into private logistics hubs tell us about the statecraft that is involved in privatizing the commons? And I'll give more specifics about that. And then finally, the third question is, what happens if decisions about how to use public resources, like these bases, are made by a definition of the public that centers the voice of communities in process, meaning those who are organizing themselves as communities? For instance, how can communities insist on public benefits and ecological equity as a framework for regional development? Okay, so those are the 3 questions that are guiding this project and that I'm trying to sort out as I gather this information for the book. All right, so before I delve into the particulars of military-based conversions, I want to talk about why I think logistics is important as an analytical framework. In my 2018 book, Inland Shift, I wanted to figure out how racial and spatial difference had shaped the character of 21st century capitalism. I picked global supply chains or logistics because they gave me a way to study modern capitalism and how this intersected with labor and ecological crisis. And when I say logistics, I mean the political, economic, social, and natural infrastructures that are required for the circulation of commodities. As I describe in the book, the scientific application of logistics technologies has enabled capitalism to flourish, a certain model of capitalism to flourish. More specifically, modern logistics has depended on racialized labor, mostly Chicana, Chicano, and immigrant labor in Southern California, increasingly on Black youth who are formerly incarcerated and returning to the labor pool, and on deadly ecological devastation in order to extract profits. Companies cut cost and added value to their logistics operations by employing racialized hiring practices that exposed immigrant workers and others to economic, social, and ecological precarity. Examples include truck drivers, mostly immigrant truck drivers, who were subjected to high concentrations of diesel exhaust as they sat idling, waiting for containers to be loaded and unloaded from their trucks. Warehouse workers whose jobs put them in physical harm, and communities that faced mounting pollution because they were being surrounded by warehouses who were serviced by diesel-emitting trains and also trucks. And so for this new work, I expand on the multiple ways that Southern California reflects how changes in global capitalism combined with changing racial demographics at the local level to produce new articulations of race, class, and development. And I know that people here are particularly interested in this kind of local global nexus as you think about race, capitalism, and empire. The region provides a valuable perspective on the geographies of race and uneven development because it underwent a dramatic demographic shift from a majority white population during the 1970s to an ethnic plurality, mostly led by a native-born. And this is where I want to make sure we don't get caught up into some of the narratives. Oftentimes when we hear the growth of Southern California's Latino population, oftentimes it's immigrants that are the ones, but the reality is that most of the population that is in the Inland Empire and inland Southern California is actually native-born Latinas and Latinos, and about 85% of those are Mexican Americans. Okay. So this ethnic plurality led by a growing immigrant and native-born Latinx population beginning in the 1980s. Simply put, to understand global supply chains and thus global capitalism, we need to understand the local articulations of race and class that I've just outlined. So with that brief introduction to the social context of logistics, what others have called the social life of logistics, and to global supply chains, I'm now going to return to one of the three framing questions that I asked at the beginning of this talk, which is how does the closure of these bases and their reconfiguration as logistics hubs relate to changes in the military and geopolitical strategies of the post-Cold War period? I argue that military-based conversions give us an opportunity to examine structural and spatial transformations that have taken place during the reconfiguration of post-Cold War capitalism. Base conversions are part of a longer history in which the architects of capitalism, both private and public, use new spatial strategies to resolve the cyclical crises that are endemic to capitalist accumulation. Here, I borrow from Giovanni Arrighi and others, who has argued that when we use examples of capitalist crisis, and as I use military bases, scholars should, quote, focus on those points in time that enable us to highlight not just cyclical, but structural transformations as well, end quote. So decommissioned military bases provide a spatial solution, or have provided a spatial solution for local policymakers as they assumed a greater role in leveraging public assets for private profit. This increase in regional control became more prevalent with the expansion of neoliberal political doctrines. Decommissioned bases also embody the multiple ways that, as Deborah Cowan has noted, corporate and military logistics are increasingly entangled. Cowan reminds us that logistics has been central to warfare and empire building. And these base conversions mark a new iteration of this historic entanglement between logistics and the military. Let me explain in more detail why I think that these military bases are significant for us to understand the geopolitics of capitalist development. Bases are and have been projections of military power that is meant to be mobilized from specific locations towards specific ends, right? That is a logistical definition of what these military bases are. They are fundamentally distribution hubs for US military power. The geographic location of military bases has shifted over time as the United States geopolitical strategy has changed. For example, post-war Keynesianism was tied to a Cold War strategy of military intervention in Asia and Latin America, among other places. Those global interventions were part of a strategy by the state to increase US economic and political interest through military means. Many scholars have written about this military-industrial complex in order to point out these connections between American economic power and American military might. So during its operation, Norton Air Force Base, which I'm going to focus on today, not the other two, was certainly a part of Southern California's military-industrial complex. Norton was the home of the Ballistic Missile Organization and the San Bernardino Material Area. Both of these missions were key parts of Southern California's aerospace industry. The base provided logistics support for the US military, especially and including helping to manage the Atlas and the Titan I ballistic missile systems. These missile systems were produced by Southern California-based private contractors that received funds from the federal government. And I'll show you, this is a picture of an Atlas missile. I'll remind you, Atlas missiles were early missile developments and early ventures into nuclear war by the United States, especially as they competed with the Soviet Union. And so these missiles were developed throughout Southern California. Different elements and components were out, whether in Vandenberg, which is where they were tested, but they were actually developed in different parts of LA County and then inland Southern California as well. This is an Atlas missile in 1958 that's being transported from one of those locations to another. And this is Sepulveda Boulevard in the Valley in LA. Here you see a bunch of Atlas missiles stored, and you can see these are, because they are early models, these were liquid propelled rockets. And later on, they changed to solid state rockets. But these are early iterations of what those rockets look like, and here they're being serviced. And then this is another Atlas missile that was being loaded onto a plane, well, being prepared to be shipped. And this is actually what was going on in the Norton Air Force Base. These rockets were essentially stored at Norton in San Bernardino, and then they were dispatched to wherever they were needed by US forces. Okay. All right. And here you see the Titan. This is a later rocket type of missile, a nuclear missile. But here they're being destroyed at the Miraloma Air Force Station. The Miraloma Air Force Station was a substation of Norton Air Force Base, just located a few miles away in the community of Miraloma. Today, Miraloma is mostly Mexican American, and it's mostly developed now. The little community of Miraloma is now surrounded by the super warehouses, mega warehouses. And they're actually converting this Miraloma Air Force Station into a super, I think it's called the World Logistics Center, which is being developed. This is actually the site. So you see, these are the old buildings from the Miraloma Air Force Station that's connected to Norton, and you can see a bunch of new warehouses that have been developed on the side. Okay. So in the 1960s, Norton would also provide logistics and maintenance for the Thor, the Atlas, and the Titan, which you saw them dismantling, ICBM missile programs, nuclear program. The base supported missiles that were dispatched across the United States and the US and to US bases in England. Norton's operations also included the Miraloma Air Force Station, which you just saw, which was a storage depot for ICBMs. In the 1960s, Miraloma was the storage and decommissioning site for Titan I missiles. Environmental scholar Brenda Sarathi has actually written about this, and I encourage you to read it. There's an article in Boom, California Journal, and she's written about this particular Air Force Station in Miraloma. So I'm trying to confirm this, but one of the things that I'm also trying to figure out is the role that Norton, I know for a fact that March played a key role in the military campaigns of Laos and Vietnam. I'm trying to figure out what role Norton played in those kinds of military campaigns. I'm going to venture ahead because I put this at the very end. I'm going to skip. So I want to show you this image, and I realized, I'm like, should I show this or not? It's speculation. But you can see here, this is an airwoman that flew in and essentially arrived and extracted Vietnamese refugees. And this is a baby Vietnamese refugee child that was being covered. Now, they delivered them to Camp Pendleton, but if you read closely here, this person is stationed at Norton Air Force Base, which totally makes sense because Norton, of course, was this logistics hub, right? And so they would bring and then I found later instances where there were Afghan guerrillas that were being extracted by Norton and flown to Norton in order to receive medical care. So there's a long entanglement of Norton in these kinds of military histories. This point, it's a curiosity and interesting. I'm trying to figure out how to make sense of it, but you can see it speaks to this historical entanglement of military and logistics that I've talked about. All right. So let me move on. As Ronald Reagan declared impending victory over the Soviet Union, and thus the forthcoming end of the Cold War, Norton became less important to the military strategy. In fact, during the late 1980s and early 1990s, military lobbyists and think tanks were arguing that the US military needed to adopt some of the same lean production and just-in-time strategies that had transformed the global economy during the period commonly referred to as globalization. One way to trim the fat out of the Department of Defense was to move away from Fordist and Cold War military models. Military lobbyists argued that one solution to budget shortfalls during the 1990s, and this is during the Clinton period, included adopting lean operating procedures that were in vogue with the private sector. This included cutting costs, outsourcing services. Many of them, the services that were outsourced, were logistics services. And let's see, shutting down bases that were no longer needed in a post-Cold War world. And as I show in this work, the death of Fordism and the end of the Cold War introduced military sites as redundant assets. These sites, which once secured and expanded post-war US economic power, emerged as devalued spaces. Their loss of value made them prime candidates for capitalist investment. And this leads me to my second framing question. What does the conversion of these public military sites into private logistics hub tell us about the statecraft that is involved in privatizing the commons? Each of these sites provides an example of how local and state policymakers responded to the rise of neoliberalism and the decline of the Cold War. The region's decommissioned military bases provided a perfect opportunity for local state actors to assume primary control over valuable real estate assets. When bases were shut down, they were often handed over to local agencies. In the case of Norton, this happened through the formation of a joint powers authority that included political leaders from local cities and from San Bernardino County. Local political leaders argued that George, Norton, and March Air Force bases offered new spatial opportunities for warehouse construction. Local jurisdictions gained control of the former military space and turned it into a quasi-public real estate market that could be used to build millions of square feet of additional warehouse capacity. Handing these bases over to private development would be done in the name of creating more jobs. These bases infrastructure capacity, which includes ample connections to freeways and long runways, made these sites prime candidates for industrial development. I just want to highlight that point because when I talk about the transfer of public assets, it's really important to understand that their location and their connection to the regions, but also to the nation's transportation infrastructure vis-a-vis rail and transcontinental rail lines is absolutely important and what makes them particularly valuable as logistics hubs. So these local state actions are a reminder that military bases signify more than projections of military power. They have also served as state investments in local military industries. Local policymakers were trying to replace an economic foundation that disappeared when the bases shut down. The closures were major events because Southern California was built on an economic foundation tied to imperial military growth. We can't understand Southern California without accounting for the military contracts and the economic development that drove Keynesian growth leading up to and after the Second World War. Scholars have written extensively of the role that the aerospace contracts played in the growth of Southern California. geographer Alan Scott has shown that between 1974 and 1988, 40.5% of all employment in guided missile production was located in Southern California. Say that again, 40% of all employment in guided missile production was based in Southern California during that period. So the question is, what happened when the military terrain shifted and brought with it federal disinvestment in local military economies? The embrace of logistics was seen as a necessary response to the local economic crisis that was created when manufacturing sectors that had once provided economic stability began to disappear. And I'm glad to see Nelson Lichtenstein here, who has written extensively about the growth of the union movement, especially in this post-Cold War period, and the production of the middle-class dream as the foundation of Keynesian policies. So Southern California was especially hard hit by shifting military strategies because the region had been so dependent on World War II and Cold War federal spending. You can see here, this is a table that was, I think it's in Alan Scott's book on the aerospace industry. But you can see just the employment. This is an earlier period. I mentioned in the 1970s and 80s. This is an earlier period of the aerospace and electronics complex, what people refer to as the military industrial complex. But you can see the tremendous amount of employment that was based in Southern California, that was rooted in the military industrial complex spending and the investment in military industries throughout the Cold War period. Here you can see Rocketdyne. Rocketdyne is one of the producers of missile technology. It's also one of the prime polluters of underground water systems throughout various parts of Southern California. I'm looking now at Norton because Norton actually, it's underground water. It's a major polluter of underground water for local communities in that area. And in that case, it was Northrop Grumman, who was also another major military and defense contractor during this period. And then this was an official bulletin that was put out in March of 1943. But you can see it's actually based in the San Bernardino Air Depot. Well, that was Norton. And so one of the things that I talk about is just the incredible economic importance and the production of kind of new jobs and manufacturing jobs. And here we can see actually that they were targeting women in particular to operate and to conduct Norton and the manufacturing that was taking place. But also there was a lot of mechanics that were being trained to run this during the war period. And I found this old bulletin. I thought it was interesting. I wanted to show that to you. Okay. Let's see here. Former military bases represent part of the geographic shift necessary for global supply chains to flourish. Decommissioned military bases in Southern California have provided new opportunities for local actors to convert public resources into private business incubators. This move is especially significant when we consider that these conversions represent, and this is a quote from an article written by Ashley et al., that these conversions represent one of the largest transfers of capital from the federal government to local groups since the period of urban renewal. And so when I say the privatization of the commons, this is exactly what I'm referring to, because it's not just happening here, as I'll mention in a second, it's happened throughout the country. I'm especially interested in examining how this massive transfer of capital has been used to expand the types of social relations and unsustainable ecologies that I wrote about in my first book. These military bases offered a cheap investment opportunity that gave private companies like Amazon and developers like Hillwood an opportunity to profit from relatively inexpensive land and infrastructure. Opportunities for private investment were created by local state interventions. It was local state actors who seized control of the decommissioned military bases and made them into logistics hubs. The three former military bases that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk are examples of how the architects of growth and development never let a good crisis go to waste. This economic model has survived major crises through a series of spatial temporal strategies. These military bases fit into this longer history. For example, geographers have argued that capitalism has become a dominant system precisely because its crusaders have consistently deployed spatial strategies to save it from impending crisis. Scholars have explained this relationship between capitalism, crisis, and space as a tendency for capitalism to resolve ongoing crises by seeking out new spatial temporal fixes. These spatial strategies can be seen in the form of geographical expansion, where capitalism seeks out new markets and resources in order to sustain its growth. David Harvey has written that the spatial temporal fix has been critical to solving various capitalist crises with the result that these new fixes reshape the geography of capitalism. Sometimes these fixes have involved the use of military force to create new markets for overaccumulated US capital. Said differently, imperialism and colonialism has often been a geopolitical strategy for the US to resolve a looming economic crisis. Historically, the military bases that I mentioned played a key role in expanding US economic power by creating new markets in foreign places, often at the barrel of a gun. They now play a key role in making local markets available for global capitalist investment. Let me back up a bit to explain how the spatial fix that I described earlier has played out in relation to military bases. And this is how it worked, at least what I'm sort of working through. The Cold War drive to expand American political and economic power led the federal government to invest billions of dollars in military-based infrastructure that could advance these goals. Over time, the investment in missiles and bases lost its value, both because the military capital was outdated, old missiles and new ones were introduced and produced in other places, and because the geopolitical strategies changed. This devaluation led to their closure and to the investment in other military infrastructures. The fact that they were devalued opened them up for new investment. In this case, by private companies who wanted to use those assets, those devalued assets, towards a new purpose. And while I use inland Southern California as my case studies, this kind of spatial fix has also occurred in other places. For instance, the Kansas City Port Authority used its jurisdictional mandate to convert the former Richard, I don't know how to pronounce it, Gibar Air Force Base into an international trade processing center. You can see that here. And then it's important to note that Kansas City is already a north-south rail hub that links Canada to the United States and Mexico. And in fact, the introduction of NAFTA and this trade corridor became increasingly important because of the production of now more and more Chinese goods that are using Mexico as an entry point into the US market. Development of the former military base and other projects links Kansas City also to Southern California's ports, because this particular intermodal hub is run by BNSF. It's tied to the Intercontinental Railroad. Okay. And likewise, 2,000 acres of the former Joliet Arsenal in Illinois, right outside Chicago, were transferred to Chicago-based Centerpoint Properties, and that's what you see here. The arsenal produced military munitions from the 1940s to 1976. Centerpoint constructed an intermodal center on the former Joliet Arsenal, and you actually just seen a small piece of what this development is. There are warehouses that expand around this whole complex. And in fact, recently, 2 million square feet plus warehouses were opened near these facilities. So here again, BNSF Rail emerged as a key figure when it stepped in to operate the same intermodal facility. And part of what I'm learning through this process is that BNSF, but also Warren Buffett's companies, who operates an intermodal and what they call door-to-door logistics companies, have been very involved in the federal conversion of local sites into logistics hubs, right? So at the federal level, there's been a tremendous amount of pressure to make these conversions happen. All right. So for this final section of the talk, um, I'm going to use Amazon's Air Hub at the former Norton Air Force Base to discuss how these larger issues that I've just discussed have played out in inland Southern California. Amazon claims to employ about 45,000 people in the Inland Empire. Southern California is absolutely important to Amazon's overall business operations. And in fact, the Southern California region operates the largest concentration of fulfillment centers in the United States. And over 40% of all of Amazon's global goods move through Southern California's ports and through these regional distribution centers. Amazon's Air Hub was developed by Hillwood. Any of you who are old enough or are political buffs will know when I say that Ross Perot, who Ross Perot is, a former conservative politician, but he was the founder of this development company, and that company has been very involved in the transformation and the development of logistics hubs throughout the country, especially here in California, but also in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So they worked in partnership with the San Bernardino International Airport and other agencies that were involved in the process. The project, named the Westgate Building, was built on 100 acres and cost $350 million in private investment. The plan included more than 700,000 square feet in warehouse space and parking for 14 all-cargo airplanes. According to planning documents, 4,000 new jobs would be created when this operation was at full capacity. Marketing materials for the airport touted access to a 10,000-foot runway and an all-cargo airport, primarily or in proximity, because it was in proximity to the BNSF intermodal container facility. This 10,000-foot runway was a key part of the former Norton military base. In fact, they built it that long. It's one of the longest, if not the longest in California, precisely to be able to deliver all of these large nuclear weapons and rockets that were being shipped in and out of the facility. So they invested millions of dollars on this long and strong runway in order to make it capable of sustaining the heavy loads that came with transporting those missiles. The same runway that was used to deliver nuclear missiles in the earlier period are now being used to deliver all of our gadgets and goodies that we order from Amazon. Other tenants in the facility include Mattel Toys, Kohl's Clothing Company or retailer, Stater Brothers, and Pep Boys. Now I'm going to move on to my third framing question. What happens if decisions about how to use public resources like these bases are made by a definition of the public that centers the voice of communities rather than on this idea of economic development? And cheap land is often cited as one of the main reasons that logistics hubs have moved inland over the past several decades. The argument goes something like this. As Southern California's ports grew, less land was available in LA County, and so people, in order to build these large distribution centers, they had to find large parcels of cheaper land, and inland Southern California provided that land. Another part of that story that is not told is often that moving inland also allowed these companies to escape some of the let's see, how should I say this? Jurisdictional claims that the Longshore Workers Union claimed on any work that was related to the ports within a 50-mile radius of the ports. So this meant that inland warehouses enabled the invention of enabled by the invention of the shipping container replaced many of the functions that on-dock workers used to do. And in this particular case, I argue that cheap labor or cheap land was made into cheap land because it represents the transfer of public wealth into the pockets of private interest. The cheap land embodied in the former military bases was made cheap at the cost of the public interest in exchange for the promise of job creation. I also show in the work that I'm working in this book that cheap land was more than empty space. It also represented the privatization of public infrastructure, mainly through these transportation infrastructures that I've talked about. Amazon's air fleet relies on the same runway as I've mentioned, but also rail and road infrastructure projects that were paid for with public tax dollars, while the site functioned as a military base. Amazon Air Hub, also known as KSBD, is only one of many large fulfillment centers that the company operates in the Inland Empire. Amazon Air also operates at the Ontario Airport, and that facility receives goods that are delivered to local consumers. What's important about this is that it actually services the rest of the Western region. That's why it's called the Western Regional Hub. I'm also going to point out that there are other workers that there are workers that increasingly are beginning to organize in this facility, but also in other facilities, also including in places like Moreno Valley, where the Amazon Workers Union has actually tried and called for an election to form a union. On August 14th, in 2022, approximately 150 workers walked off the job to protest wages and working conditions at the KSBD facility. So I'm going to show you, this is one of the groups that I'll be talking about and that were involved in this walkout, the Amazon Workers United. This is one of the facility there that I've been discussing right outside the main gates. This is the facility as it looks today and as it operates. This is the strike. You can see that they took over the sign that she was just standing in front of and put over Amazon on strike. And this is another worker. They also filed an unfair labor practice claim, arguing that Amazon had engaged in anti-union tactics and was harassing and actually disciplining workers for being engaged in union activities. The workers have called themselves the Inland Empire Amazon Workers United, and they have been supported by the Warehouse Workers Resource Center that claims there are approximately 1,400 workers at the distribution center. And as always in the union campaign, these numbers are always contested by what the union is saying and what the employer is saying. And that's done on purpose to try to change the bargaining unit and thus to weaken the effort to organize. Additionally, over 800 workers signed a petition that asked for a $22 base wage rate. Amazon responded to increased worker organizing by announcing plans to invest nearly $1 billion in frontline workers. What this meant is that the wages, or the average wage, would be raised to approximately $19 an hour, which is, of course, far below what the workers had asked for, which was $22 an hour. Workers walked off the job again a couple of months later, or a few months later, in October 14th, 2022, to show their resolve. They continued the demands for a base wage rate of $22 an hour. They also filed a complaint with the National Labor Relations Board, charging that Amazon was harassing workers and, in fact, had temporarily suspended one of the main organizers of the campaign. In a now famous memo, Amazon executives declared that ending this organizing was the company's most important public policy priority in Southern California. Amazon has also faced pressure from community organizations who claim that the company has contributed to their premature deaths by increasing local pollution. San Bernardino Airport Communities is a coalition that formed to fight what they called healthy economic development, or fight for healthy economic development in the region. The organization includes Inland Congregations United for Change, the Inland Empire Labor Council, the People's Collective for Environmental Justice, the Sierra Club, and Teamsters Local 1932, and the Warehouse Worker Resource Center, which, as I've said, I'm a member of the board, just for making sure that I say that and share that information so you can say I'm biased, and I am. This coalition advocated for the inclusion of a community benefits agreement in the Eastgate project, but the chief developer of the project, the Inland Valley Development Agency, rebuffed these efforts. Part of the conversion to non-military use has involved state cleanup and mitigation of environmental harms, and former military bases are so toxic that they often cannot be used for community purposes. This means that industrial use of former military sites is the cheaper and more profitable alternative. local and federal officials have not invested the necessary resources to make these spaces, maybe that's an Amazon alert. Um, so the diesel trucks and trains that supply these distribution hubs are emitters of deadly carcinogens, and frankly, the government has said it's too expensive to clean them up, right? And so therefore, we should make them into warehouses because that's cheaper. All right. So Amazon responded to worker organizing and community organizing concerns by mounting an aggressive counter-organizing campaign. For instance, Amazon contributed approximately $3.5 million, right? $3.5 million in 1 year to 175 organizations in Southern California in 2023, so last year. These contributions were part of a community engagement strategy that Amazon claimed in this memo that was leaked to, quote, ease market entry, end quote, into different regions of Southern California. The team responsible for the community engagement strategy was the Public Policy Community Engagement Team. This team is tasked with making Amazon into, this is what they want to be known as, the most trusted community and business partner in the Southern California area. In fact, at the core of this team's strategy is to make, quote, Amazon the Earth's best employer. And they capitalize that, right? To make sure that everybody understands that they're trying to become the Earth's best employer. So the $3.5 million that were spent on community contributions, not to mention the staff time and the resources it took to build relationships with community partners, is part of the reason the community engagement team believes it was able to maintain community support, even in the face of mounting pressure for Amazon to resolve these issues that I've brought in. And it's also one of the strategies that it's using is it's trying to build political capital by putting what it's called Amazonians on prominent Southern California boards. So they're trying to build their political leverage here. How do they achieve political or positive community relations? Amazon requires all grant recipients to submit a publicity plan that indicates how the community organization who receives these funds will obtain positive media coverage for Amazon. Those organizations that do not result in measurable positive, that do not sort of give the company the kind of positive coverage that it gets are essentially cut off from funding. So they also identified organizations that are problematic or antagonistic and said, we're not going to give them any money. That includes the Cheech Marin Center for Chicano Art and Culture, and it's located in Riverside. The Cheech Center for Chicano Art and Culture had a display of the warehouse industry, and they invited a local Chicano artist to display something, and their piece was an Amazon warehouse on fire, right? And Amazon didn't like it because they also talked about why they paint this picture of an Amazon warehouse on fire. And so they cut off the Chicano art scene totally from this kind of funding in Riverside. So I'm going to end as I began with a question. How can worker and community organizing, what I call a community in progress, help us redefine what public benefits mean when making decisions about development that use public resources in the name of the public good? What we know is that the campaigns that I described today are pushing back against local state actions that purport to be acting in the interest of those communities, but who these communities claim is predisposing them to premature death and poverty level wages. Communities are therefore using living wages, environmental justice, and human life to reimagine what development means and whose interests should be served. The idea that the market vis-a-vis jobs, and more jobs is serving the public good simply is not convincing when measured against the claims made by these communities. Their efforts are also a warning against nostalgic calls for replacing the jobs that were lost when the military bases shut down. The kinds of jobs that I showed you were part of this military-industrial complex. And too long for a military-industrial complex that once powered Southern California's economy is to ally ourselves with the legacies of U.S. military empire. The conversion of these bases embodies the continued entanglement between the infrastructures of US military empire and the networks of global capitalism that often relies on various forms of geopolitical power. The organizing that challenges Amazon ascendance is also an invitation for us to reimagine our collective economic and ecological futures. Thank you. I want to show you, I think I'm pushing the wrong button. This is a picture of the San Bernardino Communities United that was leading the campaign to stop the expansion of Norton. One of the things that don't touch on here is that Norton is run by the Inland Valley Development Agency, which is a joint powers authority, wanted to expand into the northern part of San Bernardino. And that community is historically Latino and Black neighborhood. And so they were going to destroy hundreds of houses in order to make space for new warehouses. This community fought back. It was a multiracial community that involved labor, that involved environmental justice organizations, mainstream environmental organizations, and also just people and residents from the community. And they fought back, and they were able to, for now, pause the development. The company, the Inland Valley Development Agency, says they're going to put that plan on pause. We're not sure what that means over the long run, but for now, it looks like they were successful in cutting the expansion of Norton further into San Bernardino. All right, I'm happy to take questions if we have time.
So we have about half an hour for questions, and do you want to just field your own? Just as a reminder, we're going to try to reserve the first couple of questions to grad students, so open it up.
Don't be shy. You got to remember that when somebody gives a talk and then there's nothing to be said, the question is, did people care about what I said or have anything to say about what I said? So it's always great to hear questions. Yes.
I think you said it was really interesting. Maybe this is a bit of a basic question, but I was wondering if you could just talk a bit more about like what the sort of like legislative or regulatory processes of taking that public land and privatizing it. Like, does the federal government have to like spell out these arguments that like we have this public good and we are going to privatize it and it's still good for people's jobs? Like, is there do they have to say that? Is there like what's the process like for arguing like we have this public good owned by the federal government and it's okay to privatize it?
Great question. And unfortunately for me, I've had to learn all those intricacies, right? I'm not a historian, but I've been deep diving into historical documents. But yes, so what's interesting about the BRAC process, which is the Base Realignment Commission process, is that that was a political intervention by the Congress, who decided that they need to step in to have more oversight over the Department of Defense. Because base closures have happened repeatedly, especially McNamara, who was the head of the DOD for a long time, was just shutting down, right after the war and, other periods in the 1950s, shut down a bunch of bases because they were constantly realigning their military strategies. In the 1980s, Congress started saying, wait, you're shutting down these important economic sites for us. In our jurisdictions, we want to have more oversight over how that happens. And so they created this policy, essentially they passed as part of the spending bill to say, we need to know at least a year before your intentions to close a military site. And as part of that process, you also need to show and report the environmental impact of that closure. And so that was part of the whole shutdown process. And then that was legislated through the commission and then eventually approved by Congress. So there are various steps, and I won't bore you with all the details of those steps, but there are various steps where essentially the first offer goes to other federal agencies. So you can say, oh, does anybody else in the federal government need this? But ultimately, you hand it over to local jurisdictions. Sometimes they pay for it. And oftentimes just through these joint powers authorities, because you're bringing in multi jurisdictions that are impacted by this one facility, right? And so that's the case in George, that's the case in all three of these are governed by this joint powers authority. And so then once those are converted, then those agencies are responsible for developing a development vision and a plan for how they wanted to do that. And they had meetings, it was supposed to be an open process, supposed to get community input to decide how they wanted to reimagine how those spaces could be used. Other places have done different things, like in Orange County, the El Toro base is now the Great Park, which is right next to UC Riverside, right? But in this case, what's fascinating to me is that the kind of alternative or the only thing that seemed to make sense was let's make them into logistics hubs, right? And in certain other places. And so there were people that were advocating for these places to be cleaned up, to say, hey, federal government, you polluted this thing, like you should clean up before you leave, so that we can use it for housing, so that we can use it for green space, etc. But that was not the choice that was made. The choice was this, right? And so now these joint powers authorities, which are technically run by these agencies and open to the public, they have regular meetings, they're governed by the Brown Law, etc. They're essentially running these facilities. And oftentimes they contract it to developers to do the development projects. But they are these kind of weird public-private, real estate markets, essentially, that are being run by these. Oftentimes it's people that are, the mayors of the cities or city council members or county board members that are involved in this. And sometimes some nonprofits and sometimes some business people. Yeah. Two questions there.
Thank you for the talk. You mentioned special ethics in book David Hurd. One of David Hurd's main concepts is also creative destruction. Capitalism. Here we don't see a creative destruction. It's a creative reconstruction of sorts. And I'm wondering, because David Hurd primarily talks about industrial capital.
Can you say that again?
David Hurd primarily talks about industrial capital.
Yes.
And not logistical capital.
Yes.
Is it a modality, logistical capital? It's creative reconstruction. I mean, I'm just randomly saying we can think of it in terms.
Yeah.
My point
is
something specific.
I think, I'm really not very patient with these kinds of hyper-specific ideas about industrial capitalism and logistics. For a long time, logistics was devalued as kind of as something like, well, it doesn't really affect the way that manufacturing and industrialization takes place. We know for a fact that that's not the case anymore. In fact, the introduction of lean production technologies and techniques introduced by Toyota and other companies have now made logistics fundamental part of the way that manufacturing is conducted. And so the logistics components that I refer to are not just the end products. Now we understand that it's actually all of the technologies that are used in order to measure and predict consumer demand are fundamentally integrated into the production process, right? And so logistics, yes, it's part of the industrial sort of framework that David Harvey didn't talk about. But Harvey, although I'm definitely influenced by Harvey, but it was also of a certain era in which Marxists were trying to fundamentally understand capitalism through manufacturing, and we're kind of not so interested in issues of social reproduction or issues of secondary things like logistics. But that's not the case in this case. And I write about in my book. Deborah writes about other people I've read. I think in your review of Cowan's book, you write about this as well, the centrality of logistics to understanding modern capitalism. So there's that. The creative destruction thing is interesting. I would take it back further. I mean, Polanyi wrote about this, right? And so part of that is just thinking about the means through which, what does that mean to think about creative destruction? And here I'm making the case, whether we call it creative destruction, creative, or whether we talk about it reuse. People talk about, planners talk about adaptive reuse. It's still this question about what happens when a kind of use, and in this case, federal investment in this kind of space has become devalued. This is why I think the spatial fix is such an interesting concept, because it's not just about the movement away, it's about understanding the devaluation of the existing capital, right, in that place, and how that devaluation, which was then later taken on by scholars to talk about uneven development, right, It's that devaluation of particular places that then creates an opportunity for reinvestment. And the question is, what are the sectors that are going to reinvest in those places, right? And so I do think there is this process of creative destruction that's taking place, but I tend to see it from this prospect of, okay, you had this earlier use of this space, it was provided, created all this infrastructure. What's interesting to me is that they're not wiping it all away. That in fact, the investment in the infrastructures that transportation in particular are the things that add so much value to this particular sector. See? And so I think that valuation, that continuing valuation, and the importance of the region to global supply chains is the thing that provides this entry point for this particular sector of capital to enter into that place, right? That's why they're not talking about let's make it into housing or other things, right? Because it's such a lucrative market right now in Southern California.
Do you want to maybe say your names also as we introduce yourself?
I'm inaugural. I'm not from this department. I'm from Film and Media Studies.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. My name's Neil. I'm from the history department.
I'm
yeah.
sorry. I would just say it because I put together so many different pieces of information, and
great.
historians are always like, "What the hell?"
No, I love the narrative and the pictures.
Okay, good.
Really good pictures. Yeah, my question was about funny using the phrase creative destruction. A book called Destructive Creation by historian Mark Wilson, and he writes about I was thinking of this as like an earlier analogy. It seems like kind of a recurrent feature of American capitalism is the transformation of military or military adjacent infrastructure into private hands. The sale of defense plants after World War II to private manufacturers for like $1 or insanely low prices.
Right.
So like the whole industrial landscape, or a significant part of the industrial landscape in the post-war period, comes out of this process of transferring the Defense Plants Corporation, their ownership of military infrastructure to private hands. So I wondered if this is like, if you had thought about earlier analogies of this process.
Yeah, I kind of hinted at it. I haven't get dug deep because I am focusing on these particular sites, but yeah, I mean the work that has been done around the centrality of Keynesian policies in the development of that post-war period, even leading up to the war. But meaning, what are the implications in the manufacturing base and the industries and that transfer of ownership? In my first book, I read about the Kaiser Steel Mill, which is exactly an example of this. Yeah,
that's really basic U.S. government.
Yeah. And so part of it is like to understand Keynesianism in line with this kind of military spending, right? And to see that this shift into this new kind of round of economic development marks that kind of trajectory of like moving away from a certain kind of geopolitical and economic policy, thus Keynesianism, and investment in certain kinds of manufacturing industries and building up localities like Southern California to sort of in a different direction is actually part of this transformation, and people have been struggling. So, and in the other case, with the decline of the aerospace industry, people have been trying to figure out, okay, what happened to all of those jobs that disappeared with those shutdowns. And so, Alan Scott and others have written extensively about the aerospace industry and Hollywood production and really that. But the other part, of course, that I've also been interested in is the investment in ports, right? And how so much of that was also transferred into federal spending. So it's not like that. So it's kind of a tricky argument to make. It's not that federal spending has gone away. It's that it's changed, right? It's changed. And so now, who is the biggest investor in port infrastructure and roads and rails? The Department of Transportation, right? And so there is a different form of Keynesianism or support for business and development, but it's taking this route and looks fundamentally different than investment in manufacturing industries, right? So, nothing.
Yeah, so this, what I'm trying to say here is really channeling one of my former grad students, Jesse Halverson, who I don't know, anyway, he's got a book coming out in Illinois, which is about where did the Inland Empire come from? Why? And I guess it's mild. And I'm channeling him, but I agree. It's mildly revisionist in the sense against geographers and sociologists in the sense that he wants to make it very historically sort of certain political economy decisions in the crisis of the 1970s create the opening to have the Inland Empire. It's not just cheap dirt or the racial dynamics which you pointed out, which is there. And so what happened well, two things. One, the Vietnam War made containerization, it works, okay? It took till the Vietnam War. Secondly, the stagflation of the 70s, the solution there that was offered by at least deregulation. And the specific deregulation which created really the Inland Empire was trucking deregulation, which meant that it used to be that 5 miles in the inner city was a local cartage, and there was no regulation, but they made it to 55 miles. And so all of a sudden you get this sort of, well, the owner operators and the cheap, very, very cheap stuff. The IOW, you're right, I'm glad you mentioned the IOW because there was an alternative. The alternative was to have these warehouses like in Long Beach, and the strong Teamsters Union with high wages would, make that economically viable. Whereas going off to San Bernardino was, that was not economically worthwhile as long as you had a strong unions and strong regulations. Anyway, in the mid-70s, you get this deregulation. And then Proposition 13 is really important because what Proposition 13 does is to incentivize people in San Bernardino. They didn't want to build housing tracts. Housing tracts are no longer generate a tax revenue. You want to build something else, big box stores or warehouses. And so, I want to add this political economy element, which is somewhat contingent. It's not just grand mega trends, in world capitalism, but it's specifically things that in the crisis of the 70s that we think of this as the deregularity, from factories to finance. Well, this is part of that, and the creation. So it's not an accident, comrade, that there are these distribution hubs approximately 50 miles outside of every major city in the country. And of course, the most important is San Bernardino. And that's because of this deregulation. So I'm channeling Jesse here. And I'll get in contact with him. He wrote like 600 pages on
Yeah,
this.
I'm not convinced by that argument.
Yeah, okay,
because
ahead.
I think that's this replicating the kind of deterministic ways people.
Well, it's not deterministic because it's political fights.
But the point is that I would say that probably played a role in it. But one of the things that's also important to understand is that the need for large land parcels to be able to fit and to house these kinds of logistics centers also is only important because in changes in logistics distribution systems and technology, right? And so, for example, in the 1970s, you wouldn't even begin to imagine that you would need a 1 million square foot warehouse facility. You know why? Because they couldn't manage that thing, because they didn't have the kind of software and the kind of management systems that would allow efficient movement and distribution of goods from those sites. And so, okay, so let's say that we have this kind of regulationist Arrighi model of thinking about these things. That I would say that was a major influence, but that's not determining why these things happen the way that they happen. And the reason why we have 1 million square foot warehouses now popping up left and right is because there were also these other kinds of economic shifts. And so part of a political economy approach and understanding means you have to also account for those things, right? And so even if you take a regulationism approach to thinking about how these kinds of the landscape was set up, there still needs to be another way to understand why is it that these particular spaces were developed as they were. Why do they look the way that they do today? And that has in large part to do with this kind of change in the logistics, but also changes in the technologies of the way distribution happens, right? So I would agree, like those factors, absolutely crucial. I wouldn't say that's where the IE comes from, right? Because you wouldn't understand the IE the way that it is today on the ground without understanding that in combination with a bunch of other factors.
As somebody who is from a community like this currently and like in the past like 10 or 15 years being like transformed by this exact process of uneven combined development, and it was very illuminating and insightful in some ways. And I actually spent like a small number of years actually working in warehouses like this. I'm from the Central Valley near Stockton, so there's a number of UPS, Amazon, FedEx, Tesla, all types of warehouses there. I personally, spent like 2 years working at 1 year at Amazon and 1 at a UPS warehouse in my previous life, I guess, before graduate school. And I guess one thing is that I experienced there, you mentioned that you're interested in like the dynamics of data and race and power, of course. And there's like a very, I think, as you said, like technologically mediated form of like data-driven digital surveillance that's prevalent in these types of warehouse occupations, I guess, especially at somewhere like Amazon, where they literally track every step you take around the warehouse. They know almost exactly where you're at all times. At least that's the goal, anyways. And so I was wondering if you, in line with the kind of last question that you posed, which was more geared towards like community resistance towards these kinds of processes, if you theorize at all in this book or in other works of yours about this, I guess like super exploitative process, and if so, do you connect that to like Marxist theory of like relative versus absolute surplus value?
That I have not done, that last part. But one of the things that I do write about in other works is just that idea about the connection between and the drive for logistics efficiency being fundamentally tied to this ability to track everything, every item, but also every worker as closely as possible in order to make predictions about time and space, right? And we know that, historically, that's everybody who studies labor and thinks about Taylorism, that's always been part of that attempt to try to account for labor costs, right? And account for labor time and productivity. But in this case, one of the things that I hear, especially in this facility that I'm looking at in San Bernardino, is, and workers increasingly talking exactly about this, about the use of surveillance as a form of labor control. And they're really trying to sort of figure out how to respond to that as a group of workers that concerned not only about the surveillance per se, but then how that data gets back into a kind of labor disciplinary regime, right? And sort of how that is then reflected and given back to them in the form of productivity levels and measurements of how they are doing on the job, evaluations, etc. So that's certainly part of that process. I've written about kind of the introduction, and workers have brought this up too. And of course, anybody who's we're looking at warehouses is thinking about automation within the warehouse facilities. And so what you increasingly see, and you brought up the warehouse work, the longshore workers. The longshore workers have been trying to figure this out as well, the automation of the ports. But now what you're seeing is the workers that are working alongside machines, right? But that introduces a bunch of questions, not only about servicing those machines, but also in terms of danger and on the job, ability to be hurt on the job. So all of those things are being discussed by the workers and trying to figure out, and it's easy to sort of think about those in relation to what that means in terms of labor control and a labor regime. For me and this book, I'm not focusing a lot on that. Because I'm at this point, trying to get this larger arc and trying to figure out the role that these particular sites have played in within this conversion. But I have written about it in other articles already.
Okay, yeah, I'll have to search those out.
Yeah.
I'll see I have plenty of time with time. So
Yeah, it's kind of a quick question. So going back to that idea of the public-private transfer, I guess, or just a preferential sale of the military bases. That's like a way of transferring wealth. Could you talk a little bit more about that as your theoretical framework is thinking about that as privatization of the commons? Because I think it's not clear, at least to me personally, like why the military bases, something that's polluted, fenced in, necessarily is like that privatization or of commons specifically, as opposed to public funds and infrastructure, that are kind of sunk into this. So maybe, could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, part of that comes from the taking of those lands by the federal government to make them into sites. And oftentimes that involved political decisions about which lands to take, not to mention tribal decisions about whose land is being taken, etc. But I thought what was fascinating, so one is the sort of making them into bases was already sort of creating a particular kind of relationship of what those public lands were being used for, right? And so the commons in the purpose and in the pursuit of these kinds of larger military global strategies, right? So that's one way to think. But what I thought, and I think is fascinating, is in this gesture of and this movement of turning over or turning back, military bases to local control, also created a space for people to say, how do we want to use this space now that we're able to use it for the public good? And it's this discussion about the public good that is supposed to be the motivating driver for these public representatives that are now making decisions about what to do with this reclaimed land, right? And so part of it is to think about it, okay, what happens if you think about it in terms of making them available for open space, for development around green space, for development around, on the one hand, housing, which is desperately needed in that region, or maybe even to think about what kinds of other economic development models might be, put into play based on that. And other sites have used things like, cultural art parks and all these other things, thinking about what kind of model of development. And so to me, it's that sort of that use of that terminology of the commons is because there was supposed to be a real debate about how these resources that are public resources supposed to be used towards the pursuit or towards the end of the public good. And that debate now has been ended essentially by policymakers who chose to say, we're going to throw our hat in with these kinds of logistics industry companies that want to do this and have a vision that then are supposed to represent or benefit the public by bringing in all these jobs that were lost with the base closures to begin with, right? And so the debate, right, and this is part of what I'm saying at the end, sort of these movements that are pushing back and saying, no, they're questioning the ability of these policymakers to make decisions about land use that are supposed to be in their benefit or for their benefit, when they're in fact saying, which public are you talking about? Because we're not a member of that public, right? And in doing so, they're also introducing other ways of thinking about getting back to regulation, how the public can be involved. So one of the things that I don't think I mentioned this is that they introduced this demand for a public benefits agreement. And in that public benefits agreement is a conversation that's had where you sit around the table with the developers and with the policymakers and with the communities that are organizing to say, this is what we want for this place. And if you're going to do business here, you have to do it based on our grounds, right? Our sort of ground rules. And part of what they're saying is basic minimum wages, basic kinds of working conditions, basic regulation approaches to environmental pollution, etc. So what they're trying to do is reshape the role of local governance and control over that particular place. And so that is, in a sense, trying to redefine this area as sort of a commons in which we're sort of having these communities having a voice over how development takes place in that space.
Can I actually jump on that question? Because one of the things that I think you point out in your book and that I write about as well is that one of the, I think, specific things about the way that logistics is used by policymakers is it's often claimed as a public good, right? So logistics actually becomes in the 80s and 90s, something that both local business boosters and the federal government see as a future of American development in the aftermath of deindustrialization. And so there's something I think important about that Trinankar is asking about, like, what is the specificity of logistics capitalism? Because it's not just a new cycle of accumulation that replaces industrial capitalism, but actually becomes both the kind of the thing that comes in to fill the gaps, as well as the thing that accelerates the deindustrialization that produces job loss, right? And I think I guess I was just wanting to ask a little bit about if you could say more about this way in which the claim of alternative publics wanting to make logistics, wanting to make land different, so contestations over land use are there and alive and important in all sorts of ways. But increasingly, logistics is becoming, because of the particular way that Amazon is a monopoly, kind of pursues a monopoly market capture strategy, has become so consequential in land use decisions that it actually leads and influences the ways that policymakers even make arguments around housing, right? So for example, my co-author and I who are writing about this, he is an urban planner, and in Kansas, where, you know, the land use is a little bit different, right? Because there's plenty more land to be used. In Kansas, the argument that policymakers make is that they recognize that their tax base is low-waged 20-something-year-olds who cannot afford housing. And so they make an argument for a housing subsidy, right, for the state to fill in the space left by private investment, so that the state funds housing subsidies, but not so as to provide housing as a common good, but to provide housing as a wage subsidy, essentially for Amazon. And what they literally say is, people cannot afford to take an Amazon job and afford rent. So we're going to produce subsidized housing so that Amazon will build here as opposed to elsewhere in Kansas City. So there's an interesting way that I feel like the land use stuff gets really crazy or different or specific in other areas. And one of the things that I'm curious if you have thoughts about is just the way that it becomes harder and harder to make this argument that the public good is something that's opposite from logistics, when logistics actually is able to step in to claim so much of what it does is for the public good, and then policymakers also then make an argument that what they are doing is likewise for the public good, when it's really about attracting investment, right? Scarce.
Yeah, no, those are really good points. And it gets back to, I think, one of the points that Nelson made about Prop 13 and tax increment financing and tax bases, et cetera. Because one of the things that has been argued is that not only is this a public good because it has these large national economic repercussions, but because it provides a tax base for local decision makers and then can make decisions about how to use that tax base, right? But in the IE, in Southern California, what I've been curious about is to try to figure out what is the strategy that Amazon is using. This is why I brought in that, the way that it's sort of trying to seed the ground for what it calls like easing its way into these markets and building political support and capital. And so I'm trying to trace, like, okay, who have they given money to, and what are the kinds of policies and arguments that they're making in order to justify support for Amazon. So that's part of the process, that the work that I'm doing now to try to sort of get to that specificity that you're talking about. It's like, well, what actually does it mean for Amazon to be involved in local politics? It used to be like there were, for a long time, the reason now that Amazon has this community strategy engagement team is because of the emergence of so much pushback and organizing. Other companies, for the most part, were not involved. They would hire local developers like Prologis or other developers, and they would do all that local political organizing, right? But now the fact that Amazon has incorporated that into its kind of business model is fascinating to me, because this is part of what I'm trying to get at. What is their political strategy? How are they operating? How are they making political arguments? And what does that mean for their role and how they envision their role within local policy decisions? So that's a great question. The answer is I'm not sure, but it is certainly part of the reason why I'm fascinated by how they're spending. So I just sent an email to the Warehouse Workers Resource Center, and I said, hey, have you tracked down who they've given money to? And like, no, can you help us do that? So that's an actual project that we're engaging in. And
I mean, it may be easy to get that on the tax.
That's what, yeah.
The 990 tax. I looked at the Walmart, and Walmart had like 100,000 pages of, $15 to the Boy Scouts, and I mean, every single store manager had a budget of $25,000, which
Yeah.
he spread around. So the 990 forms, I think, can give you
Yeah,
that.
so what's fascinating to me and what I really want to get a hold of is like the agreements that they give when they give funding, which because they explicitly stipulate you need to give us a plan to show us how you're going to, give us good coverage. And if you don't meet these basic points, we're not going to give you any more money. It was a fast because otherwise it's not the same as like we're just gonna put money in the pot and sweeten it. It's like we're gonna put money in the pot and then we're gonna extract these specific demands that we have, which is fascinating to me in terms of the local political activity of these companies, right? How they're making it so explicit that they're trying to do this, and how they essentially they lay out in these various internal documents how they monitor policymakers and local elected officials to see whether they're categorized as friendly or antagonistic, right? But the fact that they have a whole team dedicated to this, and here's the fascinating part, that this team is organizing now with a team in San Diego because San Diego represents the new entry point because Amazon now is increasingly focusing on U.S.-Mexico trade, right? And so this whole political strategy is fascinating. I'm not sure that we know enough about it, but I think it's definitely something that needs to be investigated. And it speaks to, again, what role do they have in changing the regulatory landscape to create these kind of pathways for future development. So again, and I hope I absolutely think that's important. I don't think that's the whole game, right? There's all these other elements that need to be understood as being part of that complex process. But we just don't know enough about how that happens, and we just focus more on it. Yeah.
Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, the 990,